wait till Katie gets back. There she is. Okay, so I think we're ready to start. Okay, this last section is about homeostasis and how do materials get transported across the semi-permeable membrane. So those are the two things we want to cover today. Homeostasis means steady state. All living things are trying to maintain some steady state where they can function at their best. And it's a dynamic equilibrium. And whenever you see the word dynamic in front of equilibrium, it means there must be two things working against each other, and they're kind of balancing these two things out. This example right here is if I were to look at a particular organism and think about the range of temperatures that where they function at, you would have a range of temperatures that we call optimal range. That's where they're functioning at their best. Okay? They're functioning at their best. So this would be the high end, that would be the low end, but they're functioning at their best. And we can use this like the human body is. What's our optimum temperature? What's our internal body temperature?
97.
Close.
Fahrenheit.
A little higher.
98.
No, just a tiny bit higher.
99.
In between there. 98.6. Now, could there be some of you whose normal body temperature is like 99? Yes. Okay, so when we say 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, and for Angela, who's probably going to be watching this, she doesn't know what Fahrenheit is because I'm sure hers is in Celsius, and it would be 37 degrees is what's normal body temperature. So this is I'm not sure even what temperature range we're even talking about here, if it's Fahrenheit or Celsius. It doesn't say that as far as I can tell. But so for us, it's 98.6 is our optimum temperature. What happens when your body temperature is elevated during a fever? How do you feel? Are you functioning at your best? No. So you become more inactive, right? You like to lay around more, you like to spend more time in bed, things like that. You're becoming more inactive. If your body temperature were to go higher than that, most people have fevers like what, 101, 102, maybe sometimes as high as 103. In rare cases, maybe higher than that. But it's usually not for very long. We will often give like Tylenol to kind of reduce the body temperatures to keep it from going too high. Because if the body temperature goes too high, our brain doesn't have an oxygen reserve like the rest of our body. So if you were to stop breathing, what parts of your body are going to be the first to suffer from a loss of oxygen? It's our brain. Okay? You're going to start having brain damage. Even at a very high temperature, like a high fever for many days, would be harmful to us. My father was a pastor he took a church in Oklahoma, and there was a younger man, younger than me, but older than you. And he was probably late 30s, early 40s, but he didn't behave like a normal person of his age. He behaved more like a middle schooler. And we come to find out is that when he had been, I think, a teenager, he had got some disease, and his fever had stayed up for a whole week, like around 105, and it had brain damage because of that. So he was still functioning like a middle schooler. He'd still giggle around girls, like you see middle school boys doing. It was weird to see an adult doing that. Now, had that fever lasted too long or gone higher, it could have resulted in his death. Now, at the other end, when you get really cold, you may start shivering, but you're not. You're just kind of focusing on trying to stay warm, right? So you're becoming inactive, and if you get too cold, what do we call it when you get too cold? Starts with an H.
Hypothermia.
Hypothermia. Hypo means below, right? So you have a below, your body temperature is dropping below, and if you experience that for too long a period of time, what will happen? You'll die. Okay? So hypothermia is not bad, is not good. What do we sometimes call it if we're out in the heat too long and we're not getting enough water to cool ourselves? What do we call the other end? What?
Heat stroke.
Heat stroke, right? So over here in this end, you're going to experience heat stroke. At this end over here, hypothermia. Both of them, if not treated, are going to result in death. So our body is trying to keep ourselves in the optimal range. The reason why you shiver, because you're trying to get your body back into the optimal range. The reason why you sweat, you're trying to get it back into the optimal range. So your body's trying to keep it at this ideal range of temperatures, body temperatures, where I function at my best. So if you're talking about temperature, there is an ideal temperature, body temperature for us. We call that an optimal point. But there's a range of temperatures that you can function. If you're sick, you can still get up and go to the bathroom. You can still eat. You maybe even go to school if you're not too sick. All those things like that. It's still in this what we would call optimal range, but not optimum. As that optimal point. Then you have a range of tolerance. Our body can tolerate a fairly wide range of temperatures, but we know that I can't remember exactly what the lower body temperature is, where it's kind of starting to get scary that their body temperatures cool down too far. But I think it's not as far as you might think. I think it's like in the low 90s or upper 80s. I think maybe upper 80s in Fahrenheit, that is. And then there's a limit to that tolerance. Once you get beyond that, then the organism's probably going to die. You're going to die if you get either too hot or too cold. Now, another way of looking at this homeostasis has to do with the solutions that are around the cell. Now, if it's a one-cell organism living in a watery environment, that would be one thing. For us, our cells are all living surrounded by the fluids that are in the bloodstream and things like that. Now, what types of environments? Well, when we did I showed you that video of osmosis and diffusion. We used the words isotonic, hypotonic, and hypertonic. Now, this has to do with, just to remind you again, this has to do with the amount of solutes, that's the stuff that's dissolved in a solution, the amount of solids dissolved in the water. So, if the amount of solids dissolved in the water outside the cell is the same as the amount of solids in the water inside the cell, then we call that isotonic. Isotonic. And so there's no what we would call concentration gradient. There's not like a concentration hill. it will be moving back and forth equally. The problem comes in is when it's one of these other two. Hypo means under or beneath. That means the solution outside the cell has fewer particles dissolved in the water than inside the cell. And let's go on to this slide here. So the concentration of the solids and water in the solution that's outside the cell equals the concentration of that, then you have isotonic. And in that, if you were to put a cell in there, the cell would stay the same size. It wouldn't swell up and pop, or it wouldn't shrink and die. So hypotonic, we said, was lower. If there's lower concentration of solids outside the cell, that means that the concentration of water is higher then, right? If you have less solids, you have more water. More solids, then you have less water, okay? So in this one, we're saying outside, this area out here, let's say, has a lower amount of solids. So that means it has a higher amount of water. Which way will the water move? Well, it's going to move into the cell. It's going to want to move into the cell. Well, what happened? It's going to happen to the cell eventually. It's going to swell up and pop, right? Well, that popping of the cell is called cytolysis. Now, cyto, that first part means what again? What's the meaning of cyte? Cell. And then lysis meant what? Does anybody remember that one? We said we'd see lysis a lot. So what was that, the meaning of lysis? It means to split. So it doesn't, here's a cell splitting. Why does it split open? Because it got too much water inside of it. So here's just kind of review what we just talked about. The water, the cell might gain water too quickly, faster than it can pump it out with the contractile vacuoles that we talked about. And it may not have any structures to help it out. One thing we do know is, like in plants, it's okay for the cell to have a lot of water under pressure, because it has a cell wall on the outside of it to contain it. It's like if you put a balloon inside of a box, can you ever blow it up hard enough to pop your balloon if it's inside of a box? No, it's pushing up against the walls of the box, and I can't push that hard. Take it out of the box, and I can blow it up to the point where it blows up, right? So if we have the cell walls on the outside that kind of help support it, it can tolerate that kind of pressure. But some cells that have to live in this kind of environment where the solids are less outside than inside, and water is always wanting to go inside the cell, it has structures called contractile vacuoles. We talked about that yesterday, that pump water out of the cell. It's pumping it out just as fast as it's coming in. And so it's trying to keep this steady state of not too much water, not too little water inside the cell. So a contractile vacuole could do that. Not every cell has that ability to do that. It's God put it in those that were going to live in that kind of environment. Now, the opposite of hypotonic is hypertonic, where there is a high amount of solute outside the cell than inside the cell. So this would be a situation where outside the cell there's less water concentration than inside the cell. Which way will the water want to move? Outside the cell, right. Outside the cell. So the water is going to want to leave the cell, and that's going to cause the cell to start shrinking. And if it shrinks enough, the water diffuses out of the cell. If it shrinks enough, it will cause the cell to actually, like, it'll also split, but the cytoplasm will actually split. So we have a different word for this one, and we made the plasmolysis, and that where the cell will actually just collapse. This is, I think we talked about that when we were using that video about putting salt on a slug, and that means that there's a high amount of solute outside the cell, and the water is going to move outside of the cells in the slug until finally the cells in the slug have experienced this, which kills the slug. But another application of this is if you give a plant too much fertilizer, it often dies. Well, it's for the same reason. It has too many solutes outside the cell, so instead of water moving into the plant to keep it well hydrated, it wants to move the other way, and it dehydrates the cell. And then the cell experiences plasmolysis, and then the plant dies. So fertilizer is a good thing, but too much causes this type of thing. Okay, so that finishes that section. Now we want to talk about how does the cell move things across its boundary. That semi-permeable membrane, how does it do that? Because remember, the membrane is semi-permeable, so that means only certain things will be able to get through. We have one means, or one way of describing this transportation across the cell we call passive transport. Passive because the cell doesn't have to put out any energy for this to happen. It's something that will happen naturally. And so this is going to be a movement of molecules with the concentration gradient. And if it's with the concentration gradient, the cell doesn't have to put out any energy for this to happen. Okay? Does not require any energy. And so regular osmosis, regular diffusion fits here. Because you don't need a cell using up its energy to move things across the boundary. It isn't just in, but it means also out. So what are some factors that will affect this transport? Well, obviously one's going to be the concentration. So if you have the concentrations right, it will naturally move across the boundary. In an ordinary cell that uses oxygen, usually the amount of oxygen inside the cell is going to be less than outside the cell, right? So oxygen is going to move into the cell. But the cell, in using up the oxygen, produces carbon dioxide, and that will build up in the cell, which will be less outside the cell, so carbon dioxide will want to diffuse out of the cell. So concentration will make this happen. Another thing is size and weight will have something to do with it. There's another factor that's brought up. The shape of the structure will affect shape of the molecule, for instance, that we're trying to move across the membrane. The charge. There are some ions. Remember, these are atoms with a charge that, depending on what charge they are, will be easily to go in or out. Some will be, because they're the wrong charge, won't be able to move in one direction. And then the membrane, remember, it's a phospholipid, and lipids were fats, fatty substances. So is it soluble in fat? Those things or in oils. If that's true, it'll make it easier for it to go through than if it's maybe water soluble. And then what is the membrane made of? Not all membranes are the same, but we gave you what most of them were made out of. So we have, under under passive transport, we have one kind where it's just going to happen on its own, just because of the concentration and things like that. But then we have what's called facilitated diffusion. It wants to go from one side to the other side because of concentration, but it needs some help. And this is one where we're going to use a protein to help it take place. The cell still doesn't have to put out any energy. It has this protein, and the protein is going to help transport the substance across. So here it would be an example of facilitating transport, where these particles are helped to go across by this protein that's inside the cell membrane. Active transport is ones where we're trying to make substances go against the concentration gradient. Instead of from high concentration to low, it's going from low to high. Well, everything in nature where you're going against whatever gradient it is, you're going to have to help it for that to happen. And to do that, you have to put out energy. Now let's just take air conditioning as an example. Which way does heat like to flow? Okay, remember last year we said we weren't going to say that. We're going to say, what? What goes up? Hot air rises, right? Because if I put my hand on the table, which way is heat going to go? Down from my hand to the table, right? So I can't say up because that's not always true. But hot air rises, right? Hot water rises. So to keep my house cool in summer, because heat wants to go into my house in summer, what do I have to do? Well, I have to run an air conditioner. Well, how do you run an air conditioner? It needs energy, right? Electrical energy to run. So I have to spend energy moving stuff against the gradient. And so an active transport, I'm going to move it against the gradient, and the cell has to put out energy for that to happen. So here is kind of a diagram of that kind of thing going. Here we have a higher concentration here than we do up here, but this structure is helping to move these inside against the concentration gradient. Because if the concentration gradient is from high to low, this is the direction it wants to go, but we need it to be the opposite of that. We need to move it from low to high. And so we're going to use this structure with energy to move it against what's natural. So if you were to kind of summarize the transports, we have passive transport. Does it move with the concentration gradient? Yes. Is energy required? No. Does it need to have a protein in the membrane to help it? No. This is just passive. It's going to happen. It actually would even happen if the cell died for a little while at least. Doesn't mean anything. Facilitated diffusion, still going with the gradient. No, it doesn't need any energy, but we're going to take advantage of proteins that are in the membrane to make it move across. We're going to use those proteins as kind of like channels to move the substances across. So does it need the protein? Yes, it needs it. But no, it doesn't need to put out any energy. The protein's just going to help it to go across. And then we have active transport that moves against the gradient from low to high. And yes, I'm going to have to put out energy because I want to move it against the gradient. And I'm going to use another protein that's in the nucleus to move it in the opposite direction. Now, let's talk about a couple kinds of active transport. We have one of them that's called endocytosis. Endocytosis. Endo means what again? Inside. Okay, just stop right there.